Okay, everyone, I'm recording.
Okay, we're good to go.
Okay, hello everybody and welcome to this webinar on teaching Spanish phonics in primary schools. So although we're looking at primary, I thought it would be worth us being aware of the Key Stage 3 National Curriculum Programme of Study, which came out in 2014 and talks about the fact that pupils should be taught to explore patterns and sounds of language through songs and rhymes and link the spelling and sound. Now, although it doesn't actually use the word phonics, that's essentially what it meant. And then the Key Stage 2 National Curriculum also has that same phrasing in it. But for the first time in June 2021, there was the Ofsted MFL review, which talked about 3 pillars of progression: phonics, vocab and grammar. Now, vocabulary and grammar have been very well known to languages teachers for a long time, and phonics probably very well known actually in the primary phase, particularly around teaching children to read and write in English, but it was not as common for teachers of languages. So this is what we're going to explore today. And it was defined in this document as the system of the sounds of a language and how it's represented in written words. And the fact that clear and reliable pronunciation and the links between sound and spelling are absolutely essential parts of learning a new language. And phonics is different from phonetics, which is a sort of university-based study looking at how the mouth forms different sounds. Phonics is just about making the sound spelling link, or sometimes people call it the sound spelling correspondence, SSC for short. You will get a copy of the PowerPoint if you'd like from this webinar. And so I've put links like where you can find this document. And if you are teaching languages, or in fact, if you're leading languages as subject leader, it's worth, you may not want to read the whole document, but I think it's worth being aware of the key aspects of it, especially in the summary at the beginning of it. And it makes me laugh when Ofsted say high quality languages education may have the following features. I think they're basically telling us that, yes, they do have those features. So it's the fact that the curriculum plan should show some clear logic behind progression in phonics. They must show it in vocabulary and grammar as well, but obviously today we're focusing on phonics, including when to teach differences between English sound spelling correspondences and those of the target language, obviously Spanish in our case. And also, where is their planned practice and review of these phonemes? So you will be expected to have a curriculum map that includes phonics as well as grammar and vocab and be able to show progression there. And that is something that the iLanguages scheme of work does have. It's ready-made and it's done for you. But later on in this webinar, I'll show you what good practice would look like. I will just say as well that feel free to put any questions in the chat while I'm presenting. Juliet may be able to answer them straight away, and if not, I'll look at the chat at the end as well. And you can also unmute at the end and ask any questions if you'd like to speak. And then even though you're teaching in the primary phase, I think it's really important for you to be aware that for the first time ever, there's some new GCSE exams. There's no other subject apart from modern languages, which is getting new GCSEs. They're going to be currently for first examination with our current year 8s. And so that will take place in 3 years' time in 2026. And for the first time ever, it talks about principles by which spelling represents sounds. And there's going to be 2 ways in particular, because we've seen some of the draft exam materials in terms of what that will look like. So in terms of the listening paper, there's going to be a section of dictation where the students will listen and they'll actually, rather than having to write out every word, they'll have to fill in a series of gaps. So they'll see some words, they'll have to hear the other words and then write them down. So they are making the sound spelling link receptively, as it were. So they're hearing and having to write that down, although there is some production because they've got to write. And it obviously will test their knowledge of grammar and spelling and vocabulary, as well as are they making the sound spelling link. But deliberately in these short spoken extracts, there's going to be 2 or 3 words that are not on the vocab list, so they probably will not have come across before. So they've got to apply their knowledge of sound spelling links to what they've heard. Luckily, for if they are going to be taking a Spanish GCSE, Spanish is a very phonetic language, and once you've learned the sound spelling links, usually vast majority of the time what you see is what you get. Then the other side of that is in the speaking exam. They're going to be asked to read aloud a short text, just 35 words long at foundation, 50 words at higher. And they won't have come across some of this language before. So a few of the words will be new as well. So again, they're having to apply their knowledge of phonics to this new text. So I think it's important to be aware of what the eventual assessment will look like at the age of 16, because you know, what you do at the primary phase can have a massive difference, and you can really lay the foundations of good phonics teaching really quickly and easily. Okay, I suddenly saw lots of comments in the chat, and I was just checking that my sound was working okay.
It's fine, Wendy. I think it was just a couple of people couldn't hear you, and I was just checking it's not the overall sound. We're good to keep going, thanks.
Fantastic. Okay, so a few months ago, I think back in November, some documents were circulating around the internet and were being referred to on Twitter. And these were some training materials that Ofsted inspectors were given, and also an aide-memoire. They didn't release this actually to schools, and I think some inspectors felt that wasn't fair, and so some inspectors made it available and you could download them. And I'm more than happy to send out both the aide-memoire and the training materials if you want to see them. And you know, I personally feel very strongly that Ofsted should be sharing that sort of thing with schools. It feels like being judged on something where you don't know what the criteria is, you know, sort of like almost having an exam but not having the specification to look at it. So we're more than happy to share it. And I've just taken a few extracts that link to phonics. So we do know that this is, as I've said, you know, and this very much links with the Ofsted research review, that it talks about the pillars of progression, and that phonics is one of them. I've highlighted here how it talks about pupils must focus on how phonics as well as grammar and vocab combine, and also that the 4 language learning skills of listening, speaking, reading and writing are the way that the language is practiced and used, and they're just vehicles, not just they're important, but they are vehicles to combine phonics, vocab and grammar, and they are themselves are not pillars of progression. So that's really important to note, actually, because I was doing a deep dive practice meeting with a primary subject lead in languages, and she got a bit confused between the skills, which are practiced and obviously assessed, and the vehicles which combine them with the pillars, which are phonics, vocab and grammar. And the sort of question that might be asked around this would be, can you show me where we are in the scheme of work, and how does this build on previous phonics, vocab and grammar learning? So you'd want to be able to explain, you know, well, maybe what previous phonemes have been taught, what's been practiced or recycled in this lesson, what's new, for example. So that would be all about knowing where you are in your progression map as well. I would just say around progression maps that I've recently been rewriting ours to make it more user-friendly. So if you do use the iLanguages scheme, the French one is done and the Spanish one will be imminent as well. And then the next thing is around pedagogy. So does the scheme of work and the planning build phonics to help pupils create and understand more complex and lengthy language? Okay, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, apart from hopefully you've got the message that phonics is very important and we do need to teach using phonics methodology. But you might be then saying, what is good practice with phonics methodology? What should I actually be doing? So I'm just going to go back to basics for a little bit and ask you if anyone can tell me, and feel free to put this in the chat, because then it feels like I'm not just speaking to my computer screen, because I can't see a single person at the moment. All I can see is my PowerPoint. So can anyone tell me, first of all, what do you think a phoneme is? Anyone give me a quick definition in the chat? And if you're struggling a little bit with that, perhaps you could just give me an example in either English or Spanish of the grapheme will be the written representation of the phoneme. So I'm giving you a clue there. So anyone give me an example in Spanish, perhaps, of a phoneme? Ah, thank you. Excellent. Okay. So yes, it's Melanie has said it's the unit of sound. Someone else has said it's the sound made by a grapheme. It's actually the smallest unit of sound. So, for example, you wouldn't just look like it's a syllable like cat. You would take the 3 different units of sound, k, a, and t, which are all separate phonemes, and they would form together to make a particular word. And a couple of people give me some nice examples of Spanish phonemes. We've got the y and the th sound, so that's great. Thank you for that. And then I've given you some examples in English, and then a few in Spanish as well. So we've got thi, je, ya, nya. And we're making the sound, we're not spelling it out like the alphabetic letter, and that's really important. So just as a comparison with English, English is a very phonologically difficult language. The main reason for that is because we've been invaded many times by the Romans, the Anglo-Saxons, William the Conqueror in 1066. And all of these invaders brought their language and mixed it in. So English is a bit of a mishmash of different languages. It's only 40% phonetic. And you can see root words from Latin and from the Germanic Anglo-Saxon languages as well. And one example to show you how difficult English is, and this is why many children struggle with reading and writing in English, and why we have a lot of children with lower reading ages and with dyslexia, is that you might get a letter string like O-U-G-H on the screen there. And if I said to you, how do you pronounce that? The answer actually is 7 different ways. And literally, how would you know? You don't know, you've just got to learn them off by heart. If that was O-I in French, wa, or if it was double L in Spanish, ya, there are no exceptions. It is always pronounced the same way. The 7 different ways, if you're interested, are U as in through, uff as in tough, ow as in bough of a tree, o as in dough that you make bread with, or as in thought, and there's a couple more. So that's just a few, but there isn't a rule that you can then just apply to all the graphemes that you see in English. It's all, I'm sorry to say, English, it's all a bit of a mess. And if you're a non-native speaker of English who's part of this webinar today, then you can probably identify with that because you've had to learn English as a foreign language. And if you're a native speaker of English, count yourself very lucky. Okay, so what is meant by to segment? If I was talking in a phonics capacity and I was asking you to segment a word, does anyone know what that means, to segment? And feel free to put it in the chat, please. Fabulous. So to say each sound separately, yeah. So we're splitting up the word and we're segmenting it and sound it out. And if you've ever listened to a child read, especially when they're learning to read, my children would be maybe reading a book and coming across a new word, and then they would sort of split it up. And when they were very new learners, they say cat when they came across a new word, and then they try and squash it together and squash the sounds together. So let's see if you can segment the word shop in English. How many different sounds does shop have? You can just type the number in the chat. This feels like when I was teaching during lockdown and I was trying to get students to do things and I couldn't have them on camera, so I had to keep asking them to put things in the chat. Fabulous. It does have 3. You are a fantastic class this evening. So let's think of another word, but one in Spanish now. How many phonemes are there in the word llamo? I used to do, say, uno, dos, tres with my class, and they all had to put it in at the same time because then otherwise they'd be looking at what other people had done. So we've mainly got it, I think. Thank you, Maria, and other people who've actually split it out like that. It is actually 4. I think a couple of people put 2 or 3. So we're splitting it out into its constituent sounds. We've just got 4 sounds in llamo. Yeah, oh. Okay. And then to blend is, I'm going to tell you that because I think you can probably work it out, is when you pushing the sounds back together. So when my children were learning how to read, they'd segment this new word out, or this word that they didn't recognize, and they say cat, and then they'd squash the sounds together and say cat. And then I'm thinking, come on, you know this word, and you've got to get them to try and work it out. But then they also apply that to much more difficult, longer words as they get better at reading, but they still use that, the phonics methodology of segmenting and blending. And it's helpful. It's not perfect in English because of all the different ways you can pronounce a particular grapheme, but it is a helpful thing, and it's very helpful in Spanish because Spanish is a 99% phonetic language. So there are 44 phonemes in what we used to call the Queen's English, now what we probably call the King's English. Apparently, if you're from the Northeast, you have a couple of extra phonemes that the rest of us don't use. Any ideas, anyone? This is another question for the chat. How many phonemes are in Spanish? Okay, we've got a couple of answers there. You don't need, it's not a pub quiz, so you don't need to Google it. We're getting very close. Anita and Anna are very, very close. We haven't had the right answer yet, though. And Mary said less than 26. You are right, Mary. I like the way you're hedging your bets there. And Natalie, you are correct. It is 25. And because Spanish is a much more phonetic language, it's not as phonologically deep is the phrase, then it has got a lot less phonemes, and other languages which are more deeper phonetically, like English, have many more. French is in the middle. If you're interested, French has 36. So that's not 100% phonetic because of the silent letter issue, but equally, it's not as deep as English. And Italian has got I think Italian is a similar number to Spanish, 24 or 25. Again, a very phonetic language. And when we are thinking about phonics, we need to think about the challenge of cognates. So cognates or neocognates are words where children see the word and they recognize them because they are very similar to English or identical, and their natural desire is to want to pronounce them like English. And you often might hear a child say something very accurately for most of the sentence, and then the one word they mispronounce could be the word that's the cognate, such as me gusta, chocolate. So it's a good idea to teach children to have a little alarm bell ringing in their head as soon as they see a cognate, because yes, they understand it, but you can almost definitely guarantee that it will be pronounced differently from the way that it looks in English. So a nice activity to do with them is for you to say the English pronunciation of these cognates and then the Spanish, and to ask the children what are the key sounds in Spanish, how do you pronounce those different sounds, where are the main differences when you compare English and Spanish. So we're doing some comparison work, which is what the National Curriculum Programme of Study asks us to do as well. So I would say something like agent, agente, euro, euro, chocolate, chocolate, prince, príncipe, rugby, rugby, dragon, dragon. Now, my Spanish isn't perfect because I only started learning it when I was about 14 at school, so I can't get my r particularly well as a native speaker, but I'm giving it my best shot. And apparently I sound exotic, according to a Spanish friend of mine. But we could see here, I won't ask you to do this, but it's a nice activity to do with a class, especially an older class like year 5 or 6, is we've got the ch sound in agente. We've got the fact that it's always a in Spanish, when the way you pronounce the a, so it's that short a in English, it's never the long r like in car. You've got the euro, the fact that you pronounce every single letter separately like this in Spanish, especially your vowels, so you don't have these double vowel sounds, these double vowel phonemes, such as the fact that we have those in English. Ch is always, ch is always ch in Spanish. In English, it could be k as in choir, or sh as in machine, or even h as in loch. Spanish, it's always ch. And again, you pronounce every single letter. So we don't have these silent e's, like these magic e's at the ends of words in English. So we say chocolate. We've got to teach our children to always pronounce that a at the end. We've obviously got the rules of the accents and the fact that you put the stress on the syllable there. We've got the r sound, which is a sort of trilled r sound. We've got the soft c when it's followed by an I, and also the rule is an e as well. And then that c does become hard when it's followed by o or u. What else have we got? I think those are the main things there when we're comparing French with Spanish. So we don't need to teach every single Spanish phoneme or sound. And probably if we just think to even the beginnings of teaching the language, what are things that children tend to struggle with a bit? And I'm just sort of thinking out loud now, probably one of the early things you might teach them is me llamo or me gusta. And the ME, I don't know about you, it's an English cognate. And children often want to jump to say me gusta or me, even me llamo, okay, because they haven't quite got that double L yet. Or the QU sound, which is in lots of question words like que te gusta, very different from English because we have the que sound. So those are ones that immediately spring to mind. These are the particularly tricky ones. We've got the vowels, which are really important. And we've got these rules with the soft h and the hard ga, 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 gu, the soft th sound, and then the cock-a-coo. So we've got not too many in Spanish, but we do have ones that we have to teach. So what is a good way to do it? Well, there's a couple of methods that we use in the iLanguages scheme, if you know about it. And one of them is a gesture method. And we've got a series of little video clips, actually. I'm going to show you a couple which were recorded by my lovely friend Rebecca. In fact, I've not seen Rebecca for about 10 years, and I saw her a couple of weeks ago, and she looks just the same. And she's native Spanish speaker, but also she was brought up in Spain, but her dad was English, so she's also fluent in English. And she did some of these videos. So we can focus on a particular action, which is similar to things like the Jolly Phonics technique, where children, especially in reception in year 1, we're learning sounds but linking them to actions. And it's also a good way if you teach the children, especially in year 3, and sort of maybe halfway into year 4, we find that a really good technique. And you can also correct children rather than saying the correction, you can show them the action. And the actions are fun. They do help to consolidate the meaning as well. So let's play one of these for you.
Yo me llamo Amarillo Zapatillas.
And then another one.
Rojo, rosa, 3, perro.
Now you can see that Rebecca can do the trill, which I'm really jealous of. So it's usually the case that if you've lived and been brought up in a country up until about the age of 7, you can pick up the sounds. But if you've not been there from that age, after that, you tend to never be able to get a sound that is, completely different from your own language. So I always say to children, let's give it a go. Let's have a go at trilling it, but we don't have to be perfect. And we all know that a lot of people who speak English have a bit of an accent. It's absolutely fine. We still understand each other. So it doesn't have to be perfection. So I'm going to show you the other way of teaching phonics, which in the iLanguages scheme, we start about halfway through year 4 and we go into year 5. And it's called, in Spanish, we have a French version as well, Planetas Fonéticos. And it's a little technique where each of the key phonemes, so we don't teach every single one, we're not teaching all 25, we're just teaching the difficult phonemes. We're not teaching the ones where the phonemes are identical, which the children will get anyway, like p, m, t, s. They're all the same, so children will naturally say them correctly. We're just focusing on the ones that are very different when you compare Spanish and English, which is about 16.
Can you think of any words with a h sounding?
So I'm going to demo this using the h phoneme. And the ideal way to start teaching using this technique is to do it once the children have have got a good amount of the language. I would say it depends on how quickly you're teaching them, but they would need to ideally have learned Spanish for a few months probably. When people are using it in secondary school, I tend to say make sure they've done it for about half a term, but in secondary school they often have, say, 3 lessons a week, so they're going to be covering things more quickly. So I'd say probably at least 6 months. So there's something to hook their learning to. And if we compare this to children learning Spanish, learning English and coming into the primary school aged 4, they've got a wider vocabulary which is spoken, so they know lots of words. So if you say to them, think of a word in English that's got the oo sound in, they'll know lots of words already. So we do need to give our children something to hook their knowledge to. So it's not a good idea to start teaching using the phonics methodology on day 1. It's a good idea to build up a bank of common vocab. So the sorts of vocab that I'd expect children to know before we use this technique would be things like greetings, introductions, colours, maybe numbers 1 to 10, maybe some months perhaps, or days of the week, maybe some animals. So let's have a think. So we're going to go now and visit our imaginary planet, Planeta. So each planet, somebody just asked me a question, and that's a really good point actually. So teaching the alphabet is very different from teaching using phonics methodology, because you're teaching the sounds that the letters make rather than saying A, B, C, D, and so on. And actually in English primary schools, they don't teach the alphabet for about 2 or 3 years. So they don't usually, because it's going to be too confusing. So you don't want to confuse the children with the alphabetic name of the letter and the sound it makes. And I would suggest that that is a really good idea. And so my very strong suggestion is don't do anything with teaching the alphabet until year 6 probably. So make sure the children have got the phonic rules really well embedded. The alphabet isn't as important as the phonics. The phonics is the whole system of pronunciation of the language. It's like a foundation building block or a pillar. The alphabet is just something that you can teach them at some point later on where they can spell things. So I would completely forget the alphabet, and I'm saying that based on good practice in terms of English methodology. So we're going to go and visit El Planeta. You do need to make sure if you use this technique that you're telling the children that they're not real planets. I think I had one time when I was teaching this in a primary school, and a child says, oh, we've discovered a whole new planetary system. And I said, no, don't go home and tell your parents that. So it's a made-up planet, El Planeta.
El planeta.
And obviously that's a fantastic sound. You can't help but hear that sound and then want to copy it, I think.
naranja,
So we asked the children if they can think of any words with the h sound in. And what I would do first of all is I would write those words on the board, and I would draw a box around that grapheme, the grapheme that represents the phoneme. Now, for the most part in Spanish, there's just one grapheme per phoneme. But it just makes it clear as well, and you can focus on the fact that there's the sound spelling link there. So we're going to have a few.
naranja,
If the children have said a word that comes up here, I might give them a merit point.
conejo, junio, julio, rojo. Ojos,
Okay, so we've got a few here, and so you can see that we're grouping language according to sound rather than according to topic. It's also a really good way to revise different language that children have already come across, and we do know that retrieval practice and revising previously learnt language, especially because of the forgetting curve and the fact that children will forget it quickly if we don't keep using some interleaved and spaced practice to make sure we're reviewing it from time to time. So this is a nice way to revise previously learnt language, but also we're looking at it in a different way. And again, this is what's used in primary schools. Children look at words and group them together according to sound. We then have a couple of activities here. They're different. So sometimes children would just listen to 2 words and just say which of the 2 words has got the h sound in. So this is called a micro listening activity. And we're just focusing on the sound rather than the meaning. And it's often a missed out stage. So often we jump straight to meaning when we do listening activities. But if we focus on sound first of all, and then children will recognize that whenever they hear the h sound, what it's going to be spelled with J, or if they hear he, could be the GE in terms of general, although that's a much less common grapheme. then it will help them in terms of developing their knowledge of the sound spelling link, and it will make them better listeners in the long run. So it's quite an easy one where it's just to listen to two words and say, is it first or second? As the time goes on and this develops, it gets harder. And so they have to listen to something longer. It could be a song or a rhyme, and do a tally of the number of times they hear the sound. And I might give children mini whiteboards to do this. I will say that when I first gave them these tallying activities, when I taught it in year 5, the children found it quite hard, but I persevered, and over time they got really good at it. And it was almost like when you go to a foreign country, your ears start to tune into the sounds and the different words, and they got better at it. So I would encourage you to persevere with that, because they do get better. So we're going to listen to this one, and let's see if we can do this activity and listen to how many times we hear the j sound.
Vengan a ver mi granja, vengan todos. Vengan a ver mi granja que es hermosa. Y el perro hace así. ¡Guau, guau, guau! Vengan a ver mi granja, vengan todos. Vengan a ver mi granja, que es hermosa. Y la vaca hace así. ¡Moo, moo!
So you've also got the added bonus of hearing what a Spanish cow sounds like.
Vengan.
And also a Spanish dog. Wow, wow, wow. So we can listen to that again. We can also read it now. So we're making the sound spelling link, and hopefully you got the fact that there was 4 times when we heard the j sound. The next activity would be a tongue twister, or sometimes there's an option of 2. And you'll see that one of these also has some other more difficult phonemes in. So let's have a look at these.
En un juncal de Junqueira, juncos juntaba Julián. Juntóse Juan a juntarlos y juntos juncos juntaron.
So that's got a really big focus on the j sound.
Jorge, el cerrajero, vende cerrajes en la cerrajería.
And although that one is shorter, it's harder because we've also got the th sound, we've got the r sound, and we've got the b sound as well. So that one also practices and revises other previously learned phonemes. So I would practice this a few times with the children, and you can play it from the PowerPoints. We've got the native speaker voiceover, or you can just say it over and over again, get the children to repeat it after you. I'd give it at least 3 or 4 times of practice before you send them off to have a go at practicing it in pairs. Some children like to stand at the front and present it as well, which is a nice thing to do. You can give them an element of choice if there's 2 tongue twisters, or you can decide which ones you want them to do. So we're doing some speaking practice here. And then finally, we're going to...
Jamón, jamón.
Oh, I've done this one wrong when I was putting it together. So I've got the same sound coming up. We could give them a transcription activity. So I could get them to listen to some new sounds that they can't read and have a go at transcribing them. But that is quite a tricky one to do. And you might think that's a step too far to begin with. Or you could just give them a series of new words that have all got the focus phoneme like these. And I would just say in pairs, 20 seconds, talk to your partner and have a go at pronouncing these. And some of these have got other phonemes that have come up previously, like the silent H as in hijo. We've got jamón, jese, jirafa. Quick practice in pairs. Maybe we do it together, and then let's check to see if we were correct.
Hijo, jamón, jersey, jirafa, México, Jorge.
And so what we've got here is a series of activities. It normally takes about 10 to 15 minutes, depending on how long you give them to do the tongue twister and so on. So it's a nice, quite short, fun way of focusing on a particular phoneme. You don't want to overdo phonemes, so you wouldn't want to teach more than one new phoneme per lesson. You also do need to go back and revise them, and that could just be by putting some words on the screen with focus phonemes that they've covered recently and seeing if they can pronounce them correctly. And obviously the information that gives you in terms of if the children are not pronouncing it correctly, it might mean that you need to go back and reteach that phoneme, which is absolutely fine. So we have a series of these planetas fonéticos in each of the key phonemes, and that goes throughout year 4 and year 5 of the scheme, and there's a different one in each lesson. But again, as I said, you do need to be adaptive and add some, reteach them again if you feel that's important. So just going back to the Ofsted Research Review, it talks about this idea of progression in phonics and planned practice and review. So what would good practice look like? You also might be asked, this is from the training materials, the aid memoir, show me how you have planned for progression in phonics. So there's not a right or wrong way to do this. It's often a good idea to start with the vowels because they are so common and they come up in so many words. In this example, we've got the QU as well because they come up a lot in question words. But the main thing is to make sure you've got a plan of probably the more high frequency ones first. Makes sense, doesn't it? So we've got some of the less high frequency ones coming later on. That is a suggested sequence. It's a good idea to front load it. So you don't want children to get into bad habits of pronunciation. So you ideally need to teach it in the first year of your language learning, or maybe halfway through the second year, depending on how much curriculum time you have. You might teach children much younger. I know many schools start at the beginning of year 3, and so you'd want to be focusing mainly in year 3. But if you do have children who are younger, you could do some phonics teaching, but again, you need to be careful not to get them mixed up with their English phonics, which is what they're doing in reception and years 1 and 2. And the training materials also talk about what would be considered strong practice. So I've highlighted those in green, so that tasks are beginning to internalize knowledge of phonics, and therefore they'll be pronouncing words correctly, engaging in conversations, asking and answering questions, expressing opinions. And even children as young as year 3 at the beginning of learning a language can express simple opinions like me gusta and no me gusta, and then start to speak in sentences. Me gustan los perros, el perro es negro, things like that. All of those are sentences in our year 3 scheme of work. And then conversely in red, I've highlighted what would be considered weaker practice. And that's where there's little thought given to teaching phonological rules and pronunciation. So if an inspector was in the room and heard children mispronouncing words, then that would possibly be a sign. Could be, it's not always, obviously, you could have taught it really well and the children have just forgotten. And if that is the case, you would show the inspector your curriculum plan and show them the phonemes that you've taught. And it could just be unlucky that they've chosen children who have forgotten. So don't worry about that too much as long as you have got that in your plan. It's always the case, isn't it, where they end up asking the one child in the room that might get it wrong. And then obviously explicit consideration needs to be given to the teaching of phonics. And I would say more recently when I've spoken to teachers, some of them say, yes, I do teach phonics. Whenever I come across a new word, I help them pronounce it. Or, we're doing the numbers, we say, un, dos, tres, and we focus on the r in tres, but that's not phonics. So phonics, good phonics teaching is when you take a particular phoneme, you look at the words where that phoneme exists, and you do the sorts of activities I've shown you. You might do an action to help them remember it. You do some micro listening activities, you do some speaking, and you get them to listen to some new words. So it needs to be, well planned and well structured, not just ad hoc when you come across a word with a difficult sound and then you focus on that. And then another strength would be where sound spelling links are covered systematically in the planning. Just say down there that sound spelling links are more complex in French than in Spanish and German. So lucky you if you're teaching Spanish. And obviously conversely, where there's no systematic approach is seen as weaker. And then interestingly, it talks about assessment as well. Assessment should include testing of speaking, listening, reading and writing. And so, for example, in our iLanguages scheme of work, we've got a set of end of year assessments for each of those skills. We've also just actually in our newest update rewritten those and created micro assessments. So we've got some mini assessments at the end of each term in each of those skills, which won't take very long to do, but some schools were saying that would be useful for them because it would link well with when they have to provide some data drops. So that is another option. And obviously the assessment should align with the scheme of learning and be checking the phonics where appropriate, in particular in the speaking and listening activities. And just to sort of finish off, sort of looking ahead towards the GCSE MFL, which is for first teaching in 2024 and for first examination in 26. In the listening exam, the children have got a dictation But to sort of bring that down to a really simple level. Now, you don't need to do this in a formal assessment, but as part of your language teaching, a nice activity might be to provide some words with just some gapped letters or some key phonemes that you've taught. And you would say the word, I'm going to say it for you now, llamo, un niño, conejo, rojo, cerdo. I can't remember what the last one was. Maybe I did cerdo twice. I got too excited about cerdos. But the idea would be that the children just fill in those gaps. And again, that assessment information, they could even just do it on mini whiteboards and hold them up. But that formative assessment information that's given you, doesn't need to be formal, is really useful, and it might help you to realise, okay, I need to go away and do some further reteaching, or maybe there's just a small group of children who I need to do a bit more phonics work with while the others do something else. So I would say that would be very valuable. And then equally, you might want to get children to do some quick pronunciation practice, and they might just get marks for pronouncing the bold underlined parts of the word. And deliberately we'll have chosen some words that they don't know, that they've not come across before, because we don't want them to do it from memory. It's a bit like the phonics check that children do at the end of year 1. Those are just made up words, aren't they? Which is a bit like a foreign language. And we're checking, are they applying the rules of phonics that they've learned? And obviously, depending on how well they do in that, is going to give the schools some assessment information on which to determine what to do next with them. And this is a very similar thing that you can ask them to do. And obviously, it's important to have support for non-language specialists, and that's something that we've sort of particularly written our scheme to support non-specialists, so that everything's got native speaker voiceovers and translations into English, and key vocabulary really clearly highlighted with correct pronunciation. So teachers don't have to say it, do anything, speak in Spanish, but the teacher can almost learn alongside the children and develop in confidence in the language. So, Julia, I'm just going to finish and pass on to you. Shall I keep recording? Was there any questions in the chat?
I was just going to mention a couple of things. So a question from Melanie, which I think will probably benefit quite a few people, is a phonics overview in the iLanguages scheme. What we have are, it's quite detailed planning on different levels. So we have a lesson plan per lesson, and that goes into depth about the age-related expectations at that point in the scheme, and also covers obviously the phoneme that we're teaching at any one time. Then we have a medium-term plan, which is per week over each year. And again, that touches on which phoneme we're focusing on. And then we have an overview scheme, which is the long-term planning per half term. So depending on what you're needing to look at, how much in depth you need to go, we've got, if you like, 3 levels of planning. Wendy and I also spoke to teachers in the East Riding who we've worked with quite a bit, and we looked at age-related planning, age-related expectations. So again, we have a document that covers vocab, grammar. What else is there, Wendy? There's reading, writing, speaking, listening, vocab, grammar, and the cultural aspect, isn't there? I think what's important to recognise, this scheme that we put together, which in its early infancy was back in 2014-15, where languages became statutory at primary level at Key Stage 2. But Wendy and I were acutely aware in our teaching, in our work with sort of local schools, that many teachers were losing peripatetics or didn't have specialists in place. So one of the big focus points for us was to put together a scheme that was going to work for teachers of different levels. So we know many of the teachers who are using this scheme knew very little at the beginning. And I think the way it works is the teachers learn alongside the children. So you don't necessarily have to be leading a lesson and have a lot of in-depth knowledge, because you can almost learn alongside the children. The other thing Wendy and I did a couple of, about a month ago, Wendy, we did an audio conversation, didn't we, based on a deep dive idea. So Wendy and I were asking each other questions and given kind of model responses, which you might find very useful if you have a potential deep dive coming up. And I think, is that on our website now, Wendy?
I think it is, Julia. I'll double check. That's a good question. Yeah, it should be.
Yeah. Wendy, I'll let you read the comment from Maria there in the box. Growing up in Spain, can you see it?
Yeah, hi Maria. I mean that it's different from the sort of true phonics teaching. Yeah, some of those graphemes are true graphemes, but some of them are two phonemes put together in letter strings. So I would really highly recommend just the individual phonemes, because there's less of them. If you start putting two phonemes together, you're going to have ma, me, mi, mo, mu, but then you're going to have that with every single other consonant, with, you know, la, le, li, lo, lu, and tate, ti, lo, lu, and so on. So if you just keep it at individual phonemes, there's less to remember. There's only 16. So hopefully that makes sense. So we are following the phonics methodology that English children use, but also that has been considered good practice by Ofsted as well.
I'll mention as well, following on from this, is that we do have a Spanish grammar webinar coming up on Tuesday, the 20th of April. That's the first week back. And in a sense that the grammar aspect flows quite nicely to this focus on phonics. So that might be something you want to look at as well. We had a question, Wendy, from Rachel, who is a teacher at an MLD special school. Do we have any specific resources? It might be worth us just talking about the mixed age group scheme. So I'll let Wendy sort of mention a bit more, but just to point out that again, during lockdown, the East Riding, which has lots of very small schools, and having to teach different ages in one class. So you've got, for example, years 3 and 4 mixed up together. You've even got very small primaries, which you might be based in a similar situation where you've got years 3 to 6 in one class. And so what we've had to do is differentiate down and up. So consider almost 3 levels, sometimes 4 in one class. So in response, Rachel, it might be the mixed age scheme is what you might want to look at. And anybody using our scheme automatically gets access to both. So you've got your standard scheme, and then running in parallel is the mixed age scheme. And as I mentioned, it's differentiated. Wendy, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, so I'd say that lots of teachers like using the mixed age scheme, even with just one age in a class, because obviously with one class, you're going to have a very wide range of ability anyway. So there's some really nice extension activities and support activities in there as well. So, for example, we've got lots of stories in our scheme of work, lots of well-known stories that children know that we've written in a really simple format. But then for an extension activity, children would look at the text of that story and see a parallel text in English of it and do some activities around that. So they're being stretched a little bit more as well. I would also just say that I've just checked our website and I can't yet see the deep dive things on there. So I'm going to have to go back to our website developer and make sure they get put on. But I just realised actually that Juliet and I have done quite a few webinars over the last 2 or 3 years, and there's lots of interesting topics on there. So we've got webinars on teaching grammar, on teaching vocabulary. They're all free for you to have a look at. We've got one where Michael Wardle, who is the lead inspector for primary languages for Ofsted, did a session on preparing for Ofsted inspection. We've got one on using stories. We've got one on curriculum progression and planning. So if you've not come across those as well, you might find those useful.
Great. So we're nearly at 7 o'clock. Any other questions before we close for this evening? We will be sending the information out. There was about 80 people registered tonight. Not everybody was able to make tonight. So we will be sending some follow-up resources for those people who were on the event tonight. But also you'll be able to access resources via our website, etc. Oh, and the book, yes, we do go into quite a bit of depth. I spoke to a couple of head teachers actually a couple of weeks ago who were using the book, and I found it really useful. And again, as Wendy mentioned, the webinars that we've run, some of those are almost kind of linked to the chapters in the book, such as cultural aspects, storytelling, using songs, etc. So it does go into quite in detail on those different aspects of the scheme. As far as we're aware, I mean, it is a fully comprehensive scheme. That's what we wanted. We didn't want people kind of having bits of one thing and another. We wanted it to kind of be fully holistic and integrated, and that's what we think we've achieved.
It does have an app as well, a language learning app that goes with it, and that links directly to all the learning, and it's got a phonics builder in there as well. It's got a grammar vote. In fact, Juliet and I, before even these 3 pillars existed, we'd put in our app a phonics, grammar and vocab builder, so maybe we had a premonition. So thanks everybody. I put a link to our book there. It's published by John Catt, but you can get it on Amazon as well. But if you like to support publishers rather than giving all the money to Amazon, then feel free. But yeah, we'd love you to, if you're interested in buying it, and we've tried to make it really user friendly and accessible, so things that you can take away straight away and try, not too theoretical. So thanks so much for everyone who's taken part in this webinar. It's been lovely to hear all your comments, and thank you for making me feel like I wasn't just talking to my computer screen as well.
Okay, thank you everyone. I'm recording at this end as well, Wendy, so
Oh, great.
we'll stop the video.
Fabulous.
Thank you everyone, and buenas noches.
Buenas noches, buenas tardes.